I don't like rolling for knowledge in tabletop role-playing games, and in today's video, I'm going to try to convince you to join me over in the static knowledge camp. Hi, I'm Peter, creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere, and normally on this YouTube channel, I sort of objectively discuss various pros and cons of different design philosophies without necessarily taking strong sides on either one. But today will be a little bit different, as I am here to pitch to you a methodology that I think works better at the table, and I hope that you all disagree respectfully with me and let me know in the comments. All right, let's get into Excalidraw, and I'll walk you through knowledge checks and why I have a problem with them. Knowledge mechanics in tabletop role-playing games are used to handle disparities between access to information. That seems a little verbose, but let me unpack what I'm talking about. There are three entities within a tabletop role-playing game usually. We have the GM, we have the players, we have the players' characters. And these three entities do not have equal access to information. The GMs know quite a bit about the world, often the most. The players sitting at the table can know a lot about the world, and even more than their player characters can know. And the player characters could, in theory, have more knowledge than the player does, simply because the players are part of the fictitious world, and thereby would have studied things within it. And knowledge mechanics in tabletop role-playing games are an effort to navigate and codify these differences in access to information in a way that seems fair and ideally not too arbitrative. And the situations that require this are often situations of insufficient information by one of the parties. Maybe the GM didn't render a scene quite as detailed enough, and so the players want to use a knowledge system to extract further information. Or maybe there's a puzzle that requires in-fiction knowledge to complete, or the deciphering of magical runes. Very common one is threat information. What does my character know about this weird monster that we've encountered so that I can, as a player, come up with a plan to defeat it? It's often used for lore dumps. You know, the GM says, roll me a knowledge check, and then kind of word vomits out a bunch of exposition that the character would know and could share with their friends. Lastly, it's also used for deduction and induction. What I mean by that is, it's used when the players have data sets, but don't understand the aggregate of that data and its impact in the fiction, and they will use knowledge to help make an additional leap. These are just common ways that these come up, and a mechanic is used to determine often the success or failure of having access to that information. Most games that codify or mechanicize knowledge follow in the Dungeons & Dragons footsteps. So D&D 5e, or 5.5, or honestly 3, or 3.5, any of these, have what's called a knowledge check. It's one of your skills. It sits alongside athletics and acrobatics and animal handling and use rope and pick lock. You have within that arcana and nature and religion and so forth that represent the skill a character has at certain spheres of knowledge. And when you want to know any of those pieces of information, like we talked about momentarily ago, any of these questions you may have, like insufficient info or monster information or what have you, you pick up the d20 and roll a skill check with a DC set by the GM. If you succeed, you gain the information, and if you fail, you don't, or maybe gain lesser information. It is up to chance and influenced by proficiency in some way or another. Now, there are a few things I don't really like about this structure, and I'm using D&D as an example, but this applies in most cases that use the same structure. So one, it's randomization based. What this means is there's a random chance that you know or don't know something that you don't have really any influence over. It's not like you have a specialization within Arcana to know a particular type of thing that falls under Arcana, like maybe you're an expert on dragons or not. And because it's random based, there's a decent chance you don't know something. Randomization like this, especially for information, is an impediment to moving forward in the tabletop role-playing game. As a GM, it's harder to plan around knowledge rolls as a way to facilitate the story, simply because the dice could be against you. It's not something that can be accounted for in adventure design, I think, in a clean way, unless what it's providing is only incidental to the adventure. Additionally, there's competition. What I mean by that is, knowledge is often placed in the same category of feature as other skills, and therefore is in competition with that resource for selecting them. You have to determine whether or not you're going to want to, have good athletics or know about religion. These two things often do not come up with the same frequency, and therefore it can devalue those knowledge skills in relation to ones that are more about survival. This is alleviated a bit in 5.5 with, fewer skills than there were in like 3rd edition, where there was 1 million skills and you had to choose between being able to swim versus being able to know about magic. Not as much of an issue these days, but it's still a competitive resource, and dollars to donuts, the more physical or survival-based skills are simply going to be used more, especially in heroic fantasy. Additionally, they're often built around these restrictions that shoehorn in what it is to be knowledgeable about things. And let me unpack what I mean by that. In real life, being knowledgeable about something comes in a lot of different forms. There are different types of intelligence at the end of the day. And what they often emphasize in these tabletop role-playing games is book learning over experience. And the kinds of things you can be knowledgeable about tend to be very narrow. There's usually only a few options that you have to pick from, and it means that you only can be an expert on often very supernatural or wondrous things, when knowledge of more mundane or setting-based information is harder to justify. And lastly, it's a limitation on world building, because you have to then make all knowledge fall within one of the existing categories. Otherwise, you offset the balance of character creation by splitting knowledges apart. Now, let's set all of those aside, though, because I think those bother me, but they're not the real reason that I dislike knowledge rolls. The real heart of it is a pacing thing. A knowledge roll, 9 times out of 10 in tabletop role-playing games, is not the operative action of that moment. It's a requirement to proceed with what will be the more interesting thing in the scene. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Before a player can act, they often need to get more information. What sort of things is this monster resistant to? What language is the runes on the door in? And so we can say the correct password in the right language. A lot of these things are not the heart of the scene, but are what are preventing the player from making an educated action that is the operative part of the scene. The more interesting part isn't, do I remember what type of damage heals a shambling mound, or is it the more operative part that I cast Call Lightning on it? You see, when you have to stop and get out the dice and roll them for what is arguably a mundane or honestly not that exciting moment, you are messing with the pacing of the scene, especially when that moment has a fail state. So if you use the study action in 5.5, which is your action that turn, right? Then you can fail at it, gain nothing, and you haven't even attempted something all that exciting this turn. It can interfere with the pacing of a game. And I think that one should clear the chaff out of the way to get to the exciting part in tabletop role-playing game design. And so if whenever the players need to gain more information before acting, they have to get out the dice, roll dice, add numbers to it, check against a DC set by the GM, and then discuss the fail state of that, you've slowed things down significantly. You've zoomed in on a moment that really doesn't deserve zooming in on. Now, don't get me wrong, I think character knowledge is important to have. I like when characters can have knowledge about the world and for that to be relevant in gameplay. I just don't like it when it's based on dice because of the aforementioned reasons. So let me give you a little pitch on how I like to handle knowledge in my TTRPG design. The way I like to handle it is what's called static knowledge. meaning you don't roll or randomize whether or not you know something. It's based on a concrete or defined aspect of the system. So the way it works in Tales from Elsewhere is if a character has knowledge on a subject, they could either be an expert or they can be familiar with it. These aren't skills, there's no bonuses associated with them. An expert knows everything that somebody in the fiction would know about that subject, what a well-educated person would be familiar with. An expert could teach a class on a subject. They're that well-informed. Now, they don't know everything there is to know on that. They only know what a reasonably educated person would know, somebody who could teach others about it. But that doesn't mean they know secret knowledge or hidden knowledge or things that simply no one would know. It just means they're highly educated on the subject. Now, someone who's familiar with a subject could carry on an informed conversation about it. They know the major players, they know core concepts, and are generally well-informed, but don't know all the nitty-gritty details that expert would know. And like I said, these aren't bonuses. These are simply categories of information. And whenever the player wishes to know something that's related to one of their knowledges, they simply state, hey, I'm an expert on eldritch things. Would I know something about this information? And the GM would say, okay, well, as an expert, you know X, Y, and Z. It's as simple as that. No die rolls, just two simple gates for information that the GM can count on. Now, what I like about this structure is it doesn't compete with any survival or combat relevant resources. You're not choosing this instead of being able to run and jump and climb trees, or things that let you wriggle free of grapples, or something lets you spot danger. This is separate from that. This is just your knowledge. And, well, within Tales from Elsewhere's character creation process, you pick knowledges based on your backstory, and so you can know a large variety of things. Because we're not painting with the same palette as skills, it means we can be more open-ended with this, because there aren't any bonuses or concrete details that need to be balanced. And during gameplay, it means that a player can ask a question of the GM before committing to an action, and it doesn't really slow things down. So you could say, hey GM, I'm about to shoot this monster, but I'm an expert on the unholy. Do I know if this undead is resistant to, bullets before I pull the trigger? And the GM would say, well, you're an expert on the unholy, so you know that bullets work just fine, but it's a zombie, so you need to land a headshot to kill it permanently. The GM can just give that little exposition midway through, and we keep moving through the scene. Much cleaner, much more expedient, and doesn't have a fail state for a character that should be knowledgeable. Now, since we've moved away from randomization, it also changes the player's relationship to investigation within the world. Because they can count on their knowledges, they then can ask more questions and start to narrow down information. And you can plan around this as a GM in Adventure Design. Let me walk you through an example. I ran a session where the players were exploring a zombie-filled haunted house, classic stuff. And a player asked the question, well, where did these zombies come from? Why are they here? And they looked down at their sheet and saw that, well, they were an expert on the unholy. That makes sense for zombies. And they said, where did these zombies come from? And I said, well, you don't have enough data yet to determine where they came from, but you know that the zombies can be caused by an Arizona tenor, they can be caused by the Bootyard Bilker, or cultists could be reanimating them. These are all valid options for a zombie to be created, but you're not exactly sure which one. But as an expert, you would know it falls into one of these three. And when you say that to the player, they start to ask new questions, trying to hone in on which one of these dangerous threats might be at play here. They start to ask things like, well, is there a graveyard nearby for the Bootyard Bilker? Or do the zombies look like they are plague-ridden or rotten away from disease? Or are there eldritch runes inscribed on their bodies that might denote some sort of dark ritual? Their knowledge arms them with further questions, which invites them to participate and investigate further. All of that without needing the dice to randomly intrude upon the sequence. And in adventure design, you can plan more easily around that. Now, I know a lot of folks like rolling their dice for everything, and they want to stop and feel like they can roll dice and figure out if they know something. They like the chance that anybody could maybe know an obscure piece of information, but that just ain't it for me. I think that it's not a great simulation of how knowledge really is within a story, where it's not so much random chance what you know. It's not like the really knowledgeable wizard can roll snake eyes on their advantage knowledge roll and suddenly not know basic arcane things when the barbarian nat 20s it and knows something that, and realistically, they probably shouldn't know. And when I am a DM in D&D, I don't usually lean on those knowledge rolls as much as just assuming people know things like the structure I described before. And I've found that tension, especially during horror sequences, is able to be maintained more easily when I only roll the dice for things that should feel tense. The more I'm rolling for things that don't impact the scene in an interesting way, the more I devalue the tension of rolling dice in general. And as a game designer, I think that we should be zooming in on, mechanicizing, and making a moment out of only the situations that are evocative for that type of gameplay. We should be streamlining the things that act as prerequisites to the more operative or action-packed part of the gameplay experience. Now, in a TTRPG that is all about knowledge and investigation without really anything more action-packed, yeah, maybe you do want to zoom in on studying or researching and knowing things, but most of the time in TTRPGs, I don't feel like the impact of that knowledge structure warrants the same level of zooming in as desperately swimming against the raging river to avoid drowning. They just don't carry the same weight. As always, I hope you found that interesting. Maybe I convinced you, maybe I didn't, but either way, let me know your thoughts about this design structure that is knowledge in tabletop role-playing games. I know I didn't cover everything under the sun that could apply, so if there's more reading or examples you'd like this community to learn from, let us know in the comments below. And as always, you can find out more in our Discord server, on our website, and our Patreon. Links to all that below. All right, y'all, catch you here next time on Tales from Elsewhere.